In some programs, you may find the need to use multiple if statements, or nested if statements. That is, an if statement that exists within another if statement. In this movie, we will take a look at two examples of nested if statements. In the first example, I have an if quantity integer greater than 100, then, at that point, if that evaluates to true, then the statement or statements that comes next would be performed. Keep in mind where I have performed statement A, that actually could be representing multiple statements. So the if statement quantity integer greater than 100 is evaluated and then executed appropriately. If that's true, after statement A is performed, another if statement is then evaluated. In this case, age integer compared to 18. If the second if statement is also true, then the statement or statements that perform statement B location is executed. After those statements are executed, then the control of the logic is then terminated and becomes outside the end if statement. That is, it exits the if-else structure itself. The perform statement C is not executed if that second if statement is true. However, if the first if statement is true, but the second if statement is false, then statements A and C are both performed. That is, statement A will be performed because the first if was true, and then statement C will be performed because the second if was false. As you can see, this provides some flexibility with your logic to allow for multiple conditions to be either true or false and still perform the desired operation. Note that if the first if statement is false, then the control is immediately transferred to the outermost else down the bottom of the screen, and statement D is performed. In this case, the inner if, that is the if age is greater than 18 statement, is not even evaluated. That is, for the second if statement to be even considered, the first if statement must be true. That is the key thing to recognize with nested if statements, that you could very easily place a code within an if statement and it will never be executed depending on the first if statement. But oftentimes this is the logic that you might need to perform the various combination of true and false conditions to perform the desired operation. Let's take a look at a very similar statement, but here we have the else has been moved up a little bit. In this case, we're comparing if quantity integer is greater than 100, then perform statement A just as in the first example. But now we are saying else perform the second if statement. So in this example, the second if statement, that is, if age integer is greater than 18, is only performed if the first if statement is false, which is really the opposite of what the first example was showing. Notice also in this example that perform statement D is going to be performed after the innermost if is performed, and also if the quantity integer is not greater than 100. You have to be very careful where you place statements that come immediately after end if statements. Recognize that the end if represents the conclusion of a logic block, and that once that logic has been executed, it will then, a flow of that logic will then drop down to the very next statement that follows the end if statement. So once again, going back to the first example, you notice that you have four possibilities, statements A, B, C, and D. But the key difference here is that the second if statement is only going to be evaluated if the first condition is true, and then the logic flows from there. Going back to the second example, here the second if statement is only going to be performed if the first condition is false. Either of these techniques is used widely in programming and might just be the structure that you might want to implement depending on the desired logic needed in your program.